The sun had barely risen, casting a soft glow over the quiet suburban streets. James stood at the front door of his house, the cool morning breeze tugging gently at his hoodie. His fingers nervously adjusted his backpack straps as he glanced at the bus stop just down the street. The first day of school was always a mix of excitement and dread, but today, there was something different in the air. Today, he wasn't just worried about fitting in. He was worried about being judged. "James, you got everything?" his mom called from the kitchen. He nodded absent-mindedly, his thoughts elsewhere. "Yeah, I'm good," he replied, though the pit in his stomach was growing. His mom appeared in the hallway, wiping her hands on her apron, a smile stretching across her face. "I know it's a big day, baby, but remember, just be yourself. You're more than enough." James managed a tight smile. "I know, Mom." His mom had always been supportive, always telling him to stay humble, to never let anyone define his worth. But that advice was easier to hear than to put into practice. In the world he lived in, being black meant constantly feeling the weight of people's expectations, and most of the time, those expectations weren't good. He'd gotten used to it. Or at least, he tried to. As he walked to the bus stop, James couldn't help but replay the events of last year in his mind. Last year, he had been in the back of the class, rarely called on by teachers, a quiet kid trying to go unnoticed. He had never liked standing out. Not in a place where people could decide his worth based on how he looked. Today, he told himself, would be different. This year, he'd try to stay in the background, stay invisible. It was easier that way. Safer. When the school bus arrived, James climbed aboard and found his usual spot, towards the back, near the window. As he settled into his seat, he tried to calm his nerves. It was the same school, the same routine, but this year felt different. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. It was almost like a whisper in his ear, telling him that today was not just another day. At school, the atmosphere was buzzing with the noise of excited students gathering in groups. Some were catching up after summer break, others were still finding their way to their classes. As he walked down the hallway, James kept his head down, hoping not to make eye contact with anyone. He didn't want to draw attention to himself. He didn't want to be the black kid in the room. He just wanted to be James. As he made his way to his first class, a wave of tension settled over him. It was always the same, walking into a classroom, meeting new faces, and knowing exactly how they'd see him. His appearance, his quietness, his skin color, it all spoke before he ever said a word. And it wasn't that he was afraid to speak up. He was afraid of what people would think when he did. His first class of the day was English, and it was no surprise that the teacher, Ms. Lambert, was the first one to catch his attention. She stood at the front of the class, clipboard in hand, scanning the list of students as they filed into the room. James noticed her glance linger on him for a moment longer than the others, an eyebrow raised as if she was silently judging him before he'd even sat down. He took a seat in the middle row, as far from the front as he could manage, and tried to make himself as small as possible. Ms. Lambert made her way to the front of the room, and the class quickly quieted. "All right, class," she said with a sharp tone, her voice cutting through the room. "Welcome to the first day of English. This year, we're going to focus on the classics. I expect nothing less than excellence from all of you." James didn't need to look up to know she was talking about the students she expected to do well. The ones who stood out. The ones who were always ready to answer questions and raise their hands. The ones who seemed to have it all together. He wasn't one of those students, and he knew that Ms. Lambert had already pegged him as someone who wasn't going to contribute much. She had that look about her, the one that silently said, "You won't be a challenge for me." James kept his head down and opened his notebook, the words of his mom echoing in his mind, "Just be yourself." But how could he be himself when himself didn't seem to fit in anywhere? Ms. Lambert walked through the aisles, handing out syllabi, and paused when she reached James's desk. For a brief moment, their eyes met. James quickly looked down at his notebook, but not before he saw the flicker of judgment in her eyes. "Here you go, James," Ms. Lambert said with a cool smile, almost as if she were doing him a favor. He took the syllabus from her, but didn't say anything. She moved on to the next student, and he let out a quiet sigh of relief. He couldn't shake the feeling that Ms. Lambert had already decided who he was without ever getting to know him. The rest of the class passed in a blur of introductions and expectations. James didn't speak much, only answering when called upon, his voice barely above a whisper. He could feel the eyes of his classmates on him, some curious, others indifferent. By the time the bell rang and the class filed out, James felt like he'd already been through an entire day. Ms. Lambert's eyes lingered on him as he left the room, and for some reason, it made him uncomfortable. It wasn't the first time he'd felt like this, like he was being sized up before even having the chance to prove himself. But something told him that Ms. Lambert's judgment wasn't just about his quiet nature. It was about something deeper. He exited the classroom and found his way to the next one, trying to shake off the feeling of being an outsider. He didn't want to stand out. He didn't want to make waves. He just wanted to make it through the year without drawing too much attention to himself. But as he walked down the hallway, something told him that this year, things were going to be different. He wasn't sure how, but he knew in his gut that the path he was about to walk wouldn't be the same as the ones before. He just didn't know yet whether that was a good thing, or a bad thing. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from, the voice in his head said, the same line he'd seen on so many videos. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? James's answer to that question was simple: his mom. She was his constant reminder to never give up. And maybe, just maybe, this year, he wouldn't have to hide. Maybe it was time to show everyone who he really was. But the question was, would they be ready for it? The next few days passed in a blur. James settled into his routine, navigating the sea of unfamiliar faces and trying his best to blend in. Every morning felt like a new beginning, but it also felt like a battle. His teachers were all different, but one thing remained constant: there was always that feeling of being watched, of being judged. Ms. Lambert's class, however, was different. She was sharp, no nonsense, and she seemed to carry an air of authority that James could already tell would be tough to crack. Every time she walked into the room, her gaze would briefly sweep across the students before focusing on a few who were her students, the ones who were eager to answer questions, the ones who made her job easier. And then there was James. He had become accustomed to being overlooked or underestimated, but Ms. Lambert had an unsettling way of making him feel like he was invisible and under scrutiny at the same time. James had spent his first few days in her class just trying to get through the lessons without drawing attention to himself. He never raised his hand unless he absolutely had to. He kept his head down during discussions, only offering his opinion when it was unavoidable. He was used to the quiet approach, but Ms. Lambert wasn't going to let him stay quiet for long. It wasn't long before she noticed James's behavior. "James," Ms. Lambert said one day during class, her voice cutting through the hum of students. He froze. "Yes." James looked up to meet her gaze, trying to mask his unease. "Are you going to contribute today, or are you just going to hide behind that notebook the entire semester?" she asked with a thin smile. A few students snickered, but James didn't react. He could feel his pulse quicken, his palms beginning to sweat. He wasn't sure if Ms. Lambert was trying to provoke him or if she genuinely thought he wasn't capable of speaking up. Either way, he didn't like the way she had singled him out. James started, his voice trailing off. The eyes of the class were on him now, waiting. He had never been good at public speaking, especially not when he was the target of a teacher's comment. He fumbled for something to say but quickly shut his mouth. It was safer that way. Ms. Lambert didn't let the awkward silence linger. "I see," she said, her tone laced with something that almost felt like amusement. Well, when you decide to engage, let me know. Until then, I expect you to take your seat and pay attention like everyone else." She turned away and continued with the lesson as if nothing had happened. James couldn't stop the feeling of humiliation from settling over him. It wasn't that he was shy or uninterested in the subject matter. He just didn't want to draw attention to himself. He had always been cautious, careful not to stand out too much. He wasn't about to give Ms. Lambert the satisfaction of being one of the distracting students who always had something to prove. But it was clear that in her eyes, he wasn't doing enough. The rest of the class passed in a haze. James sat quietly, trying to focus on the lesson, but the sting of Ms. Lambert's words stayed with him. He tried to convince himself that she didn't know him, that she was just like every other teacher who didn't give him the chance to show what he could do. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized, he wasn't like everyone else. Ms. Lambert's bias. It didn't take long for James to start noticing patterns in Ms. Lambert's behavior. She had a way of picking out certain students, the ones who seemed to fit into her image of the perfect pupil. And then there were the others, those who didn't quite match up with her expectations. James, unfortunately, seemed to fall into that latter category. When she called on him in class, it was often with an undertone of doubt, as if she were expecting him to mess up or not have the answer. It wasn't overt, but it was there. The way she would glance at him, then quickly move on to someone else after he gave his answer, it was subtle, but it hurt. One afternoon, after a particularly brutal round of questioning, Ms. Lambert made another one of her snide remarks. "James, I'm sure you've heard of this book before," she said, sarcasm lacing her voice. "Though, I'd hate to assume." The class chuckled, and James could feel the heat rising in his cheeks. This was exactly what he had feared. She had already written him off. To her, he was just another student who wasn't going to amount to much. And he hated that feeling, that sense of being stuck in a box that he couldn't break out of. It wasn't just Ms. Lambert's words that hurt, it was her attitude. The way she treated him, as if his worth was predetermined by his appearance or his quiet demeanor, stung more than anything. But James didn't show it. He kept his head down, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing him upset. He was used to it, after all, it wasn't the first time he'd been judged for things beyond his control. It had always been that way. What Ms. Lambert didn't know, what no one knew, was that James wasn't just any student. He was far more capable than anyone could have imagined. While Ms. Lambert and his classmates saw a quiet, reserved teenager who never seemed to speak up, James's mind was a labyrinth of thoughts, ideas, and insights that could easily rival any of his peers. James had always been gifted when it came to academics, particularly when it came to problem solving. Whether it was math, science, or history, his mind operated in ways that were far beyond his age. But he kept it hidden. He didn't want to attract attention, didn't want anyone to think he was showing off. He preferred to stay in the background, where he felt safe. But safety came with a cost. Ms. Lambert's constant dismissals started to build up. James didn't want to be a part of her drama, but he also knew that one day, something would have to give. He could only stay silent for so long before the weight of his unspoken thoughts became too much to bear. And there was another part of him, buried deep down, that wanted to prove her wrong. Not just to prove that he could do it, but to show her that the way she saw him, and the way she saw so many other students like him, was wrong. James wasn't going to let Ms. Lambert define him. He couldn't. But how would he break free of the trap she had unknowingly set for him? For now, he kept his head down, staying quiet, but in the back of his mind, a plan was beginning to form. This wasn't just going to be another year of getting through it. This year, he would show everyone that they had underestimated him. And when he did, Ms. Lambert would know exactly what she had missed. James sat in his room later that evening, the glow from his desk lamp casting long shadows across the walls. His math textbook lay open in front of him, but his mind wasn't on the lesson. He wasn't thinking about equations or solving problems. He was thinking about Ms. Lambert. The way she'd spoken to him in class earlier, with that thinly veiled sarcasm, was still fresh in his mind. It wasn't the first time he'd been treated that way. Teachers had underestimated him before, but something about her attitude felt different. Maybe it was the way she had dismissed him so casually, or maybe it was the way she had made him feel small in front of everyone. Either way, it didn't sit right with him. James pushed the math book aside and leaned back in his chair. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that only came late at night when everyone else in the house was asleep. He loved these moments, when everything slowed down, and he could finally think. The pressure of school, of fitting in, melted away. But tonight, the quiet was different. He couldn't shake the thought that he had to do something about Ms. Lambert. He couldn't just let her walk all over him like that, not again. His eyes drifted to the corner of the room, where his old guitar sat, gathering dust. He hadn't played it in months. Music used to be his escape, his way of channeling all the noise in his head into something productive. But lately, he had stopped playing. His life had gotten too complicated, too focused on fitting in and staying out of trouble. James pushed himself up from the chair and walked over to the guitar. He picked it up, his fingers brushing against the strings as if reconnecting with an old friend. He strummed a few chords, the familiar sound filling the room. That was when it hit him. It wasn't just Ms. Lambert he had to prove something to, it was himself. He had been hiding for too long, pretending to be someone he wasn't, all in the name of blending in. But what if he stopped hiding? What if he let himself be who he truly was, for once? It didn't matter if the teachers didn't get it. It didn't matter if the kids at school didn't get it. What mattered was that he stopped being afraid of standing out. James closed his eyes, strumming a few more chords, letting the music flow through him. He felt something stirring deep inside, a spark of hope, a reminder of who he used to be before he became obsessed with fitting in. The next day, when he walked into Ms. Lambert's class, he wasn't the same James who had been hiding the day before. Something had shifted inside him. Maybe it was the music, maybe it was the realization that he was worth more than the judgment that had been cast upon him. But whatever it was, he wasn't going to take it anymore. As he entered the classroom, he could feel Ms. Lambert's eyes on him immediately. She was at her desk, looking through papers, but she paused as James walked in. There was something in her gaze, something that made him pause for a moment. For a second, he almost turned back around and walked out. It would be easier that way. But then he remembered the spark, the reminder that he didn't have to be invisible. He wasn't going to shrink in the face of judgment anymore. He took his seat at the back of the room, but this time, he didn't slump down. He sat up straight, his eyes focused on the board. Ms. Lambert didn't say anything, but he could feel her watching him. She'd already made up her mind about who he was, quiet, reserved, maybe even a little slow. But that wasn't who James was. As the lesson began, James felt the familiar tug of self-doubt, the urge to shrink away, to let her think what she wanted. But he fought it. He was stronger than that now. Ms. Lambert called on students one by one, asking questions about the reading. James kept his head down, pretending to focus on his notes, but his mind was elsewhere. He had learned the lesson of the day before, the one Ms. Lambert was teaching: to stand out, you have to risk being seen. When the bell rang for the end of class, Ms. Lambert's eyes lingered on him for a moment before she stood up and addressed the class. James gathered his things and made his way to the door. He wasn't in a rush to leave. There was something tugging at him, a desire to do more, to make a statement. But he wasn't quite sure what that statement would be yet. As he stepped into the hallway, he overheard a conversation between two students. "Did you see James today? He looked different. He wasn't hiding in the back like he usually does," one of them said. "I know, right?" "He actually sat up straight, like he was paying attention for once," the other one responded, clearly surprised. James didn't know how to feel about that. It wasn't like he had done anything major. He hadn't spoken up in class, hadn't done anything extraordinary. But somehow, just by showing up and holding his own, he had made an impression. The next day, when he walked into Ms. Lambert's class again, he was ready. He wasn't sure what he was expecting to happen, but he knew something had changed. Sure enough, Ms. Lambert called on him during the lesson. She was giving a lecture on the theme of identity in the novel they were reading, and she paused, glancing at James. "James," she said, her tone still sharp. "What's your take on the protagonist's struggle with identity? Do you think they're destined to fail, or is there hope for them?" This time, James didn't hesitate. He lifted his head, his voice steady but confident. "I think the protagonist is struggling because they're trying to be something they're not. They're stuck in other people's expectations of who they should be. But I think they can find a way to break free, if they start being honest with themselves." Ms. Lambert's eyes narrowed slightly, as if she hadn't expected that kind of answer from him. The class was silent for a moment. James could feel the weight of their stares, but he didn't shrink away. Finally, Ms. Lambert nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Interesting," she said, before moving on to the next student. James sat back in his chair, his heart pounding in his chest. He had done it. He had spoken up, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had finally shown a part of himself that no one had ever seen before. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And as the days passed, James found that the more he let himself be seen, the more he discovered about who he truly was. No longer would he let anyone define him, least of all Ms. Lambert. There was more to him than anyone knew. And he was ready to show them. James felt different as he walked into school the next day. The tension in the air that had clung to him like a heavy fog for so long was gone. He wasn't invisible anymore. He was there, and he was ready to face whatever came his way. But more importantly, he was beginning to realize that maybe he didn't need to shrink into the background to survive. It was Tuesday, and that meant it was time for Ms. Lambert's weekly quiz. James had always done well in her class, but it had never been about proving anything to her. It had always been about getting through the lesson, staying unnoticed, and hoping that he wouldn't get called on. But today, James wasn't afraid. As he entered the classroom, he saw the stack of quizzes on Ms. Lambert's desk. Her usual authoritative presence was in full force as she handed out the papers to the students. Her eyes skimmed over each student, her gaze briefly stopping on James before moving on to the next. There was something in her eyes, something that made James feel like she was trying to figure him out. She had made up her mind about him before, but maybe, just maybe, he could change that perception. "All right, everyone," Ms. Lambert announced, her voice cutting through the chatter. "You have 20 minutes. This quiz is on last week's readings and notes. Do your best, and no talking. You may begin." James took his quiz and settled into his seat, pen in hand. It wasn't that he was worried about the quiz itself. He had read the material, and he was confident in his understanding of it. But what did worry him was the knowledge that Ms. Lambert would be watching closely. She had a way of observing students, as if she was always waiting for them to make a mistake. As he read through the first question, James's mind started to wander. He knew the answer, of course, but his thoughts kept returning to the way Ms. Lambert had dismissed him before. How she assumed he was just another quiet kid who wouldn't amount to anything. He wasn't going to let that slide anymore. Not when he had so much more to offer. James began to write his answers with precision, his thoughts moving faster than he could keep up with. The words seemed to flow effortlessly onto the paper. He was in his element, and for the first time, he felt like he wasn't just doing the work to survive the class. He was doing it because he was capable of it. He had always been good at this, at figuring things out and making connections. But no one had ever really noticed. Ms. Lambert didn't seem to care about the effort he put in. She cared more about whether he was one of her ideal students, the ones who always had something to say, the ones who loved to talk and raise their hands at every opportunity. James finished the quiz with a few minutes to spare, but instead of rushing to hand it in, he looked over his answers. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the usual sense of dread. There was no fear of judgment, no worry that Ms. Lambert would find some flaw in his work. He had done his best. That was all that mattered now. Ms. Lambert had finished walking around the classroom, checking students' progress. As she approached his desk, James met her eyes. For a brief second, their gazes locked, and she held his stare longer than usual. It wasn't an approving look, there was something about the way she looked at him that made James think she was still trying to figure him out. "You're done already?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. James nodded, offering a small but confident smile. "Yes, I finished early." Ms. Lambert didn't respond immediately. She just took his paper from his desk and walked back to the front of the room, where she began to collect the completed quizzes. But James couldn't shake the feeling that she had taken notice of him in a way she hadn't before. When the quizzes were handed back a few days later, James felt his stomach churn. It wasn't that he was worried about his grade. He had always done well in Ms. Lambert's class. But something about this time felt different. As Ms. Lambert passed back the quizzes, she finally reached James's desk. She didn't make eye contact as she placed his paper down in front of him, but James could already feel the tension in the air. He picked it up, his hands suddenly clammy. A big, red A was circled at the top of the page, followed by a note in Ms. Lambert's distinctive handwriting: "Well done, James. Keep it up." For a moment, James just stared at the paper. He had gotten an A on the quiz, sure, but it wasn't the grade that mattered. It was the note. The fact that Ms. Lambert had acknowledged him, even if it was just a simple, "well done," meant more than he could explain. For the first time, she had noticed him for something other than his quietness. She had seen his work and recognized it for what it was: good. But that wasn't the only thing that was different. James had noticed something else about her. As she moved around the classroom, handing back quizzes to other students, he could feel her eyes lingering on him now and then. It was subtle, but it was there. Ms. Lambert was no longer dismissing him. She was paying attention. After class that day, as James packed up his bag and started heading out the door, Ms. Lambert called out to him. He paused in the doorway and turned back toward her, surprised. "James, could you stay for a moment? I'd like to talk to you," she said, her voice more inviting than it had ever been before. James nodded, though his stomach twisted with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. He walked back toward her desk and stood there, unsure of what to expect. Ms. Lambert was looking at him now with a different expression. It wasn't judgmental or critical, it was thoughtful. "James," she began, "I've been watching you lately. You've been a lot more engaged in class than you used to be." She paused, as if considering her next words carefully. "I want to challenge you. I've noticed you have potential, more than you let on. I know you're capable of much more than you show. But I need you to start speaking up, start showing your ideas. Don't hide behind your quietness. I know you have a lot to offer." James's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't what he had expected. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice a little quieter than he intended. "I mean," Ms. Lambert said, leaning in slightly, "that I think you could be one of my best students, James. But you need to step out of the shadows. Show the world what you're capable of." For a long moment, James didn't know what to say. This wasn't the same teacher who had mocked him before. This was someone who saw him for who he was, someone who believed he had more to offer. "Okay," James said finally, his voice steady. "I'll try." And for the first time, James truly believed it. He wasn't just going to try. He was going to show Ms. Lambert, and everyone else, exactly what he was capable of. James's mind raced as he left Ms. Lambert's classroom that day. He had always known that he had the potential to do more, but hearing it from her, someone who had been so critical of him, felt different. It was as if a door had been opened, a possibility he hadn't even dared to dream about until now. He had spent so long hiding behind his quietness, convinced that blending in was the only way to survive. But Ms. Lambert had seen through that. She had seen the potential that he had kept locked away for years. And now, she wanted him to bring it out into the open. But could he really do it? Could he really step up, speak out, and show the world what he was capable of? For the rest of the day, those questions haunted him. It wasn't like he had never spoken up before. There had been times in class when he contributed, when he had something to say. But it was always measured, always careful. He never gave too much of himself away. He never took the risk of being vulnerable. Ms. Lambert had asked him to do just that, to take the risk. And the thought terrified him. What if he failed? What if the other students didn't take him seriously? What if she ended up disappointed? James knew he couldn't keep hiding forever. He had to take the first step. But how? That night, he sat at his desk again, the same guitar in the corner of the room, waiting for him. He didn't touch it this time, though. Instead, he picked up his notebook and started to write. Not about the quiz or the lessons they had learned, but about something else entirely. He wrote about his fears, the things that had held him back all these years. He wrote about the times he had hidden in the shadows, too afraid to speak up. He wrote about how, even now, he was afraid of standing out, of drawing attention to himself. But as he wrote, he also wrote about the possibility of change. He wrote about the idea that maybe, just maybe, he could stop running from who he really was. Maybe, he could stand up for himself. And as he wrote, something inside him began to shift. The next day, as James walked into Ms. Lambert's class, he felt a nervous excitement running through him. This was it. Today, he was going to speak up. Today, he was going to let the world see who he really was. He sat in his usual seat at the back of the class, but this time, he didn't slouch. He sat up straight, his hands resting on his desk as he prepared himself mentally for what was to come. Ms. Lambert began the class as usual, going over the lesson for the day. She spoke about the character development in the novel they were reading, asking the class how the protagonist was evolving in the story. James felt the familiar urge to shrink back, to keep his thoughts to himself. But he remembered what Ms. Lambert had said, "Don't hide behind your quietness." He could feel his heart pounding as the class continued, but he forced himself to pay attention. He couldn't back out now. When the class was asked to discuss their thoughts on the protagonist's journey, James raised his hand. His own breath caught in his throat as Ms. Lambert's eyes landed on him. "Yes, James," she said, clearly surprised to see him participating. It felt like the entire room paused for a moment. James's voice wavered slightly at first, but he pushed through. "I think the protagonist is struggling with their identity because they're trying to please everyone around them. They don't know who they really are yet, so they're just following what others expect of them." Ms. Lambert nodded thoughtfully, but her eyes never left him. "Interesting," she said, and James couldn't tell if she was pleased or just surprised. The room fell silent again as students began discussing his point. James felt the weight of their eyes on him, but it wasn't the same as it used to be. He wasn't hiding anymore. He wasn't shrinking. And for once, he felt proud of himself. The rest of the class passed in a blur. James contributed more to the discussion, his confidence growing with each word. It wasn't easy, but it felt right. As the bell rang and the students began to leave, Ms. Lambert stopped him as he was packing up his things. "James, that was good," she said, her voice softer than usual. "You really brought something to the table today. I'm glad to see you stepping up." James smiled, feeling a surge of pride. "Thanks," he said quietly, though inside, he was glowing. It was only a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. He had spoken up. And for the first time, he didn't feel like he had just been a quiet observer. He had been heard. Over the next few weeks, James continued to change. The more he participated in class, the more he began to see himself in a new light. Ms. Lambert had been right. Once he stopped hiding, once he allowed himself to be seen, he realized just how much he had to offer. It wasn't just about school anymore. It was about his relationships, his confidence, and his ability to be true to himself. He found himself speaking up more in conversations with his friends, no longer afraid of being judged. And even when he felt nervous, even when doubt crept in, he reminded himself of what Ms. Lambert had said, "Don't hide behind your quietness." But it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were still moments when he felt the old familiar fear clawing at him. He still caught himself holding back when he didn't think anyone was watching. It was a constant struggle, a battle between the old James who was afraid to stand out and the new James who was learning to embrace his voice. Then came the next big test, a group project in Ms. Lambert's class. James was paired with a few students who had always been the popular ones. They were loud, confident, and always took charge. At first, James didn't know how to fit in. He had always been the quiet one, the observer. But this time, he wasn't going to let that hold him back. When it was his turn to present his ideas, he spoke up. His voice was steady, his thoughts clear. And though he could see the surprise in his teammates' faces, he didn't care. He wasn't just showing up anymore, he was participating, contributing, and letting his voice be heard. Ms. Lambert watched from the front of the class, a small but approving smile on her face. James was starting to believe what he had always doubted, that he had the power to change things, to take control of his own story. And just like that, the transformation had begun. He wasn't just the quiet kid anymore. He was someone who could make a difference. James could feel the change within him. It wasn't just a shift in his confidence, it was more profound than that. It was as if a part of him that had been buried deep inside was finally starting to come to the surface. He was learning how to navigate the world in a new way, how to speak up, how to be seen. And it wasn't easy. There were days when he felt like he was walking on a tightrope, balancing between the old James and the new one. The most surprising part of this transformation, however, was the way others began to notice him. Not just Ms. Lambert, who had become a constant source of encouragement, but also his peers, his classmates. They were starting to look at him differently, with new eyes. He wasn't just the quiet kid in the back of the room anymore. He was someone worth paying attention to. One afternoon, after another successful class discussion, James was packing his things when he was stopped by a voice that was completely unfamiliar. "Hey, James. Can I talk to you for a second?" James turned to see Ethan, one of the most popular kids in the class. He had always been in the spotlight, always surrounded by a group of friends. James had never really interacted with him outside of class, and to be honest, he didn't think Ethan had ever noticed him before. So to hear his voice directed at him now took him completely by surprise. Sure," James said, his heart suddenly pounding. Ethan leaned against the desk, looking slightly awkward. "I've been noticing you lately in class, man. You've really been stepping up. It's cool to see you actually contributing to the discussions. I think a lot of people didn't realize how smart you are." James blinked, unsure of how to respond. He hadn't expected this at all. Ethan, the guy who was always leading the group, the one who always had something witty or clever to say, was talking to him about his contributions. It was a moment he wasn't sure he could fully process. "Thanks," James said, trying to sound casual, though he could feel a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I mean it," Ethan continued, looking at him seriously. "I've always known you were quiet, but I didn't realize it was because you were holding back. I think you've got a lot to offer. I'm just saying, you should keep doing what you're doing. You're changing how people see you." The words hit James like a ton of bricks. Changing how people see you. He had never really considered the impact of his presence on others. But here was someone who had always been in the spotlight, someone who seemed to have it all figured out, telling him that he was changing the way people looked at him. Before James could process it, Ethan clapped him on the shoulder. "Anyway, just wanted to say that. Keep it up, man." As Ethan walked away, James stood frozen for a moment, feeling both proud and overwhelmed. Could this really be happening? Was he really starting to change, to grow? And did it really matter to people like Ethan? But the answer became clear in the days that followed. James's presence in class grew more undeniable. More and more people started acknowledging him. He didn't just blend in anymore, he stood out in a way that felt right, even if it was still a little intimidating. The next day, as James walked into Ms. Lambert's class, there was something different in the air. There was an energy that he couldn't quite place, but it felt like everyone was watching him, waiting for him to do something. He took his usual seat and began unpacking his things, but his mind kept wandering back to Ethan's words from the previous day. It wasn't just the compliment, there was something in the way Ethan had spoken to him that had made James realize just how much he had been hiding, even from himself. Ms. Lambert walked into the classroom and started her usual routine. But this time, she made a point to stop by James's desk before starting the lesson. "James," she said with a small smile, "I just wanted to check in. How are you feeling about everything? I've noticed you've been more confident in class lately. And I have to say, it's been wonderful to see." James looked up at her, unsure of what to say. He didn't want to sound boastful or arrogant, but he didn't want to downplay the change either. "I think I'm getting there," he said honestly. "It's still hard sometimes, but it feels different now. I'm not so afraid to speak up. I'm not worried about what everyone else will think." Ms. Lambert nodded, her eyes soft with understanding. "I'm proud of you, James. I know it hasn't been easy for you, but I can see the growth in you. And it's not just about speaking up. It's about believing in yourself, knowing that what you have to say matters." James smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. He had heard those words from Ms. Lambert before, but this time they felt different. She believed in him. She saw him. "I know," he said, his voice a little quieter but filled with determination. "I'm starting to see it, too." Before Ms. Lambert could respond, the bell rang, signaling the start of the lesson. But James couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, not just in him, but in his entire approach to school. It wasn't just about grades anymore. It was about embracing who he really was. The rest of the week passed quickly. James continued to participate more in class, and each day felt like a small victory. But it wasn't just the academics that were changing. James was slowly but surely building new relationships with his classmates. One day at lunch, James found himself sitting with a group of students he had never really spoken to before. There was Ethan, of course, but there was also Kelly, a girl in his class who had always been a bit of an outsider, just like him. And there was Brandon, another quiet kid who sat alone in the back of the class. They weren't the popular kids, the ones everyone else wanted to be friends with, but there was something about them that made James feel like he belonged. They were talking about a new movie that had just come out, and for the first time, James felt like he had something to contribute. He had seen the movie the night before, and he wasn't afraid to share his thoughts on it. His opinions were different from everyone else's, but they mattered. And as he spoke, he saw his classmates nodding, listening, and even asking him questions. It was strange. Just a few weeks ago, he had never imagined he would be sitting at a lunch table, actually engaging in conversation. And now, here he was, laughing with people, sharing stories, and feeling like he was part of something bigger than himself. It wasn't just the friends he was making. It was the fact that he was starting to believe in his own voice. He wasn't just the kid in the back of the room anymore. He wasn't just the quiet observer. He was James, smart, capable, and, most importantly, worthy of being seen. As the days passed, James continued to grow in confidence. But it wasn't just his classmates who noticed. Ms. Lambert, ever the watchful teacher, had been keeping track of his progress. And one afternoon, as class ended, she asked him to stay after for a moment. "James," she began, her tone serious yet warm, "I've been really impressed with your transformation. Not just in class, but in how you've been presenting yourself. I think you have something special, and I want to help you build on that." James felt a thrill run through him at her words. "What do you mean?" "I'm assigning you to lead the next class discussion," Ms. Lambert said, her eyes sparkling with encouragement. "You're more than ready for this. I want you to take charge, show your peers what you're capable of. No holding back." For a moment, all James could do was stare at her, his heart racing in his chest. Was this really happening? "I won't let you down," he said, his voice steady and sure. "Good," she said with a smile. "I know you won't." And just like that, James realized that he wasn't just stepping out of the shadows anymore. He was stepping into the light, and he was ready for whatever came next. The days leading up to James's first time leading a class discussion felt like a whirlwind. Every time he closed his eyes, he could picture the room, his classmates watching him as he stood at the front. The pressure of it was almost unbearable. Yet, there was something else, something in the pit of his stomach, that felt like anticipation. Excitement. He had never been in a position like this before. To be in charge of a discussion, to lead others, it felt so foreign. He was used to watching from the back of the room, unsure if his voice even mattered. But now, Ms. Lambert had given him this chance, this responsibility. And deep down, he knew he couldn't let her down. What if his classmates didn't take him seriously? What if they laughed at him? Worse, what if he froze, unable to say anything at all? Every doubt he had ever had came flooding back in that moment, clouding his thoughts. He sat at his desk for a long while, staring at the notebook in front of him, feeling overwhelmed. It felt like the pressure was building up inside him, threatening to explode. But then, he remembered something Ms. Lambert had told him: "You have something to offer, James. Trust yourself." Those words cut through his fears like a knife. He had to trust himself. He had to believe that he was capable of doing this, just like he had believed in his ability to speak up in class and be heard. So, he took a deep breath, picked up his pencil, and continued his preparation. He wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to let his fear control him. This was his chance to show who he really was, to prove that he was more than just the quiet kid. The next day, James arrived early to class, a notebook in one hand, his notes in the other. His heart was pounding in his chest, and his palms were sweating. He was standing in front of his classmates, about to lead the discussion, and the nerves were almost too much to bear. Ms. Lambert arrived shortly after, her eyes lighting up when she saw him standing at the front. "Are you ready, James?" she asked, her voice steady but encouraging. "I think so," he replied, though his voice didn't sound nearly as confident as he felt on the inside. Ms. Lambert gave him a reassuring nod. "You've got this. Just remember to breathe." He nodded, taking one more deep breath before stepping to the front of the room. His classmates were already in their seats, chatting among themselves. When James cleared his throat, the room fell silent. The sudden quiet felt like a weight on his shoulders, but he forced himself to stand tall, to project his voice. He had come this far, and there was no turning back now. "All right, everyone," he began, his voice wavering at first but growing stronger with each word. "Today, we're going to talk about the protagonist's internal struggle. How does their journey reflect the theme of identity in the story? And what does that teach us about our own lives?" The class remained quiet, waiting for someone to speak. James took a deep breath and launched into the discussion, asking open-ended questions, guiding the conversation without dominating it. At first, his classmates were hesitant, unsure of whether to speak up. But as the discussion progressed, James's confidence seemed to spread to the rest of the class. More students began raising their hands, contributing ideas, and debating the points James brought up. For the first time, James wasn't just observing the conversation from the sidelines. He was guiding it. His thoughts were shaping the discussion, and he felt the rush of power that came with it, the power to influence, to steer others toward a deeper understanding. And then, it happened. Midway through the conversation, when James had asked a particularly challenging question, a student named Sarah raised her hand. She was one of the quieter kids in the class, and James had always noticed how she tended to shy away from speaking up. But today, she was different. "I think," Sarah said slowly, "that the protagonist's struggle with identity is a lot like what we all go through. We're always trying to figure out who we are and where we belong. It's not just a story, it's real. I mean, don't we all feel like that sometimes?" James was taken aback. He had expected some participation, but Sarah's insight struck him in a way he hadn't anticipated. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, as if everyone was waiting for him to respond. He nodded thoughtfully. "Exactly, Sarah. That's the key. The struggle for identity is universal. It's something we all can relate to." The rest of the class followed Sarah's lead, contributing more thoughts, building on each other's ideas. James felt a wave of pride wash over him. He wasn't just a leader of the discussion, he was part of it, just as much as everyone else in the room. When the bell finally rang, signaling the end of the class, James felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. He had done it. He had led the discussion, and it had gone better than he had ever hoped. As the students filed out of the classroom, Ms. Lambert approached him, her smile wide. "That was fantastic, James. You did an excellent job," she said, her voice full of praise. "You guided the class so well, and you encouraged everyone to participate. That's a skill not many people have." James felt his chest swell with pride, but he also felt a bit overwhelmed. He had never been the center of attention like this before, and the experience had left him both exhausted and exhilarated. But there was one thing he knew for sure: he could do this. He could be a leader. As the days went by, James's confidence continued to grow. He was no longer the quiet observer in the back of the room. He was an active participant, a leader, someone who had a voice, and was not afraid to use it. His classmates treated him differently now. They respected him more. Even those who had never really noticed him before began to seek out his opinions. His voice had power, and people were starting to listen. But the real surprise came when Ms. Lambert pulled him aside after class one afternoon. "James," she began, her voice serious, "I want you to consider applying for the leadership program. I've been keeping an eye on you, and I believe you have the potential to go far. This could be your opportunity to take the next step in your growth." James was speechless for a moment. Leadership program? He had never considered anything like that before. But now, as he thought about it, he realized that this was exactly the type of opportunity he had been looking for. "I'll think about it," he said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet excitement. "I'm confident you'll make the right choice," Ms. Lambert replied. "I've seen what you're capable of, James. Now it's time for you to see it too." James walked out of the classroom that day with his head held high. For the first time, he saw his potential, not just in the classroom, but in the world beyond. The quiet kid who had once feared to speak up had found his voice. And now, he was ready to step into the spotlight. James spent the next few days thinking about Ms. Lambert's suggestion. The idea of applying for the leadership program seemed daunting at first. He had never considered himself a leader, and the thought of standing alongside others who had more experience, more confidence, it felt like a huge leap. But something inside him kept pushing back against the doubt. Maybe it was the way his classmates had started seeing him differently, or maybe it was the way he had felt standing in front of the class, guiding that discussion. He had taken a step forward, and he couldn't let fear hold him back now. It wasn't an easy decision. James spent hours researching the program online, reading about what it entailed, what kinds of leadership skills they looked for, and what the requirements were. The more he read, the more it started to feel like a perfect opportunity, an opportunity to build on everything he had been learning. It was a chance to continue growing, to challenge himself in ways he had never imagined. That weekend, he made up his mind. He was going to apply. The application itself was more complicated than James had anticipated. There were essays to write, questions to answer, and recommendations to gather. He had never been one to seek out attention, and asking for a recommendation felt like a big step for him. But with Ms. Lambert's encouragement still fresh in his mind, he sent her an email, asking if she would be willing to write one for him. Within hours, he received a response. "James, I'm so proud of how far you've come. I would be honored to write a recommendation for you. I'll make sure it reflects your growth and potential. Keep pushing yourself." The email brought a sense of relief. If Ms. Lambert believed in him enough to write a recommendation, maybe he was on the right path after all. Over the next few days, James poured his heart into the essays. The questions were all about leadership, what it meant to be a leader, how he had demonstrated leadership in his own life, and how he planned to make a difference in the future. As he wrote, James found that he had more to say than he thought. Every experience he had had over the past few months seemed to tie into the question at hand. The way he had taken charge of the class discussion, how he had started making new friends, and how he had gained confidence, all of it came together as a testament to his growth. He hit submit on the application, feeling both nervous and proud. It was done. There was no turning back now. After submitting the application, James found himself checking his email constantly, waiting for a response. The days seemed to drag on, and with every passing hour, the anticipation only grew. He knew the process would take time, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. What if he didn't get in? What if they didn't see what Ms. Lambert saw in him? To distract himself, James focused on his studies and continued participating in class. His classmates were still responding to him more positively, and with each passing day, he grew more comfortable with his new role. He had stopped seeing himself as the shy, invisible kid. He was part of the class, part of the conversation. Still, the idea of the leadership program lingered in his mind. He found himself daydreaming about what it would be like to stand in front of a group of students, sharing his ideas, leading discussions, and making a difference. It seemed like a far-off dream, something he never thought he'd have the courage to do. But the more he thought about it, the more it felt like something he was ready for. Then, one afternoon, James received an email that made his heart stop. Subject: Leadership Program Application Status. James hesitated for a moment before opening the email. His stomach flipped as he clicked on it. Dear James, thank you for your application to the leadership program. We are pleased to inform you that you have been selected as a candidate for the next round of interviews. We were impressed with your application, particularly your essay on how you've demonstrated leadership in the classroom. We believe you have the potential to make a positive impact, and we would like to learn more about you in an interview setting. Please let us know your availability for the next 2 weeks so we can schedule your interview. James couldn't believe his eyes. He had made it to the next round. For a moment, all he could do was stare at the screen, his hands shaking. This was real. He was actually being considered for this opportunity. It was a feeling he couldn't quite put into words. The next few days were a blur as James prepared for his interview. He knew the interview would be the next hurdle, the next test of his abilities. He had never done anything like this before. But he was determined to give it his best shot. Ms. Lambert, seeing his nervous energy, offered to help him prepare. They met after school one day, going over potential interview questions and practicing how to speak about his experiences confidently. James, Ms. Lambert said during their session, the key to this interview isn't just about answering questions. It's about showing them who you really are, your growth, your potential, and your passion for leadership. You've already shown you have those qualities in the classroom. Now, it's time to show them in person. Her words resonated with him deeply. He wasn't just applying to be a part of a program. He was applying to step into a role that would push him even further, a role that would help him grow in ways he couldn't even imagine. The day of the interview arrived, and James's nerves were at an all-time high. His palms were sweaty, and his heart was pounding as he walked into the building where the interview was taking place. He was surrounded by students who, on the surface, seemed much more confident, much more like the natural leaders James had always admired. But as he sat in the waiting area, he remembered what Ms. Lambert had told him: he had his own strengths. He had his own journey. And that was enough. When it was finally his turn, James was led into a small conference room where 2 staff members from the program were waiting for him. He shook their hands, and they gestured for him to sit down. "James, thank you for coming in today," one of the staff members said, smiling warmly. "We've reviewed your application, and we're excited to hear more about you." James took a deep breath and began to speak. The words flowed more easily than he had expected. He talked about his experiences in Ms. Lambert's class, how he had grown from the quiet, unsure student into someone who was beginning to step into leadership. He talked about the ways in which his own struggles had shaped him, making him empathetic and determined to help others. He spoke with passion and honesty, and by the end of the interview, he felt a sense of relief. It wasn't perfect, but he had given it everything he had. And that, he knew, was enough. Now all James had to do was wait again. But this time, he felt a sense of peace. No matter the outcome, he had come so far. He had pushed himself beyond what he thought was possible, and that, in itself, was a victory. His journey was far from over, but it had already changed him in ways he couldn't yet fully understand. And whatever happened next, he was ready. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. Have you ever had to step out of your comfort zone to chase something you didn't think you could achieve? What pushed you to do it? A few days after the interview, James had nearly convinced himself that he hadn't made the cut. His nerves had started to settle, and he found himself once again focusing on his studies and daily routine. Despite the optimism that had carried him through the interview, doubt crept in. He wasn't sure if he was good enough, if the interviewers had seen what Ms. Lambert had seen in him. Maybe he had been too nervous. Maybe he hadn't articulated himself well enough. One evening, just as he was finishing his homework, the sound of an incoming email notification made his heart skip a beat. He didn't recognize the sender's address, but when he clicked it open, his pulse quickened. James sat up straighter, his hands shaking as he clicked the message open. "Dear James, we are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted into the leadership program. Your application impressed us greatly, particularly your insights on leadership and your demonstrated growth as a leader within your school. We believe you have great potential, and we are excited to offer you a place in the program. Please see the attached information for the next steps and orientation schedule. Congratulations, and we look forward to seeing you thrive as a leader." James couldn't believe it. He blinked at the screen for a moment, his mind racing. The words felt surreal. He had made it. He had actually made it. His heart was pounding in his chest, and a rush of excitement flooded through him. He had worked so hard for this, and now, it was happening. All the doubt, all the fear, had been worth it. The first thing James did was grab his phone and dial Ms. Lambert's number. She picked up on the second ring. "Hello, James. What's going on?" Ms. Lambert, James couldn't contain his excitement. I got into the leadership program." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then, Ms. Lambert's voice came through, full of joy. "James, that's incredible. I knew you could do it. I'm so proud of you. You've earned it." "I still can't believe it," James said, his voice shaking slightly. "I don't even know what to do next. There's so much information, and I don't know if I'm ready for all of this." "You're more than ready, James," Ms. Lambert reassured him. "This is just the beginning of an amazing journey. And trust me, if you could do what you've already done, you can do anything. James smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. Thanks, Ms. Lambert. I honestly couldn't have done it without your support. She laughed softly. You did the work, James. You believed in yourself, and that made all the difference. They talked for a few more minutes before hanging up, but James couldn't stop grinning. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment that had seemed so out of reach just a few months ago was now his reality. The first day of the leadership program was fast approaching, and James could hardly contain his excitement. The orientation details were clear, but it was hard to focus on anything else when his mind was spinning with possibilities. When the big day finally arrived, James felt a mixture of nerves and anticipation as he walked into the program's headquarters, a large building with sleek, modern decor. The moment he stepped inside, he could tell this was going to be something different. There were groups of students milling about, talking excitedly, and he felt a strange sense of belonging. He wasn't just a quiet kid anymore, he was now part of something bigger. As he checked in, a coordinator handed him a folder full of information about the program, including the schedule, goals, and what to expect over the next several months. This is it, James, he thought, gripping the folder tightly. This is the opportunity I've been waiting for. At the orientation, James was introduced to the other students in the program. To his surprise, they weren't all what he had imagined. Some of them were loud and confident, while others were just like him, quiet, reserved, but with something to offer if given the chance. As the group gathered, one of the leaders of the program, a tall, charismatic girl named Emily, stepped forward. She introduced herself and gave a brief speech about what the program was all about, how it would challenge them, push them to grow, and teach them essential skills for leadership. James felt a little overwhelmed by the energy in the room. Emily seemed to know exactly how to command attention, and the other students appeared to already know each other. But James reminded himself that he had come here to grow, to be pushed out of his comfort zone. This wasn't going to be easy, but it was going to be worth it. Later in the day, the group was divided into smaller teams, and the first challenge was announced. It was a team-building exercise designed to test their communication, problem-solving, and leadership skills. The task was simple in theory. Each team had to build a tower out of everyday materials like straws, rubber bands, and paper clips, but the catch was that they only had 10 minutes to complete the task, and the tower had to stand on its own for at least a minute. James was assigned to a team with 4 other students. They were all different in personality, and at first, James wasn't sure how they were going to work together. Some of the team members were clearly eager to take charge, while others were content to follow along. James found himself in the middle, unsure of how to contribute. He was used to being quiet, stepping back, letting others take the lead. But as the clock ticked down, something changed inside him. He realized he had an idea, a way to build the tower more efficiently. It wasn't the flashiest idea, but it was practical. He spoke up, suggesting they create a stronger base before adding height. At first, there was hesitation. Some of the group members didn't think it would work. But James persisted, calmly explaining his reasoning. Slowly, the team started to follow his lead. They adjusted their strategy, and within minutes, they had built a sturdy base and an impressive structure. When the timer went off, the tower stood proudly in the center of their workspace. Emily, who had been overseeing the challenge, came over and clapped her hands. Great job, team. That was an excellent example of collaboration, and James, your leadership really made a difference. James felt a rush of pride, but more importantly, he realized something. He had taken the lead, even if just for a moment. He had found his voice and stepped up when it mattered. This was only the beginning. The days that followed were full of challenges, activities, and workshops, each one pushing James out of his comfort zone. He began to see a shift in himself. He was no longer just an observer, but an active participant in his own growth. He wasn't perfect. He still had moments of doubt, moments when he felt like he didn't belong. But with every challenge he faced, James grew stronger. He realized that leadership wasn't just about being the loudest or the most confident, it was about listening, problem-solving, and helping others reach their potential. And with Ms. Lambert's guidance and encouragement, James knew he was exactly where he needed to be. James was riding high after his success with the team-building challenge. He had started to believe that maybe, just maybe, he had what it took to succeed in this program. It felt like the more he pushed himself, the more confidence he gained. Every day was a new opportunity to learn, to grow, and to prove that he belonged. But just as he started to feel comfortable, something unexpected happened. A setback that shook him to his core. The next big challenge came in the form of a group project. The students were split into teams again, but this time, the stakes were higher. Each group had to create a detailed proposal for a community project, a project that could have a real impact in the local area. The team with the best proposal would receive funding to put their plan into action. James was excited at first. This was a chance to make a real difference, to use his newfound leadership skills in a tangible way. But as soon as he saw who was in his group, his excitement quickly turned to dread. One of the students in his group was Brian, a classmate from his school who was known for being arrogant and always trying to take control of everything. Brian had a reputation for being the alpha in any group he was in, and James knew from past experience that working with him would be difficult. Brian was always quick to dismiss others' ideas and push his own agenda. As the group gathered to discuss their project, James immediately felt the tension. Brian spoke first, naturally, and took charge of the conversation. "We need something big, something flashy that will impress the judges," Brian said, his voice full of authority. "I'm thinking something related to technology. Maybe a coding program for kids. It's new, it's trendy, and it's bound to get attention." James wanted to speak up, to suggest a different approach, something that addressed a more immediate need in their community. But every time he opened his mouth, Brian quickly dismissed his ideas. "That's not what we're going to do," Brian interrupted him. "We need to think bigger, think about what's going to get us noticed." As the meeting continued, James grew increasingly frustrated. It wasn't just Brian's arrogance, it was the way he completely shut down everyone else's input, including his. James felt like he was being pushed to the side, his thoughts and contributions ignored. At one point, Emily, the program leader, walked by and noticed the tense atmosphere in the room. She stopped for a moment and asked if everything was okay. "Yeah, everything's fine," Brian quickly answered, shooting James a look that told him to stay quiet. James wasn't sure what to do. He felt helpless, unable to make his voice heard. He had been so proud of how far he had come, but now it seemed like all his progress was slipping away. He had already dealt with the fear of not belonging. Now, he was dealing with the fear of being silenced by someone who seemed to have all the answers. The days following that meeting only made matters worse. Brian continued to dominate the project, and James felt more and more like an outsider. Every idea he suggested was met with resistance, and every time he tried to offer his perspective, Brian either brushed him off or mocked him. James felt stuck. The group was moving forward with Brian's ideas, and James felt powerless to stop it. His frustration built up, but he couldn't find the courage to stand up to Brian. After all, Brian had the confidence, the experience, and the loudest voice in the room. What could James possibly contribute that would make a difference? The other group members seemed to agree with Brian's direction. They weren't as vocal as Brian, but they didn't challenge him either. James felt completely alone, like his voice was irrelevant. One afternoon, after another frustrating meeting with the group, James found himself sitting alone in the school courtyard, trying to clear his mind. He was tired of feeling like he didn't matter. He had worked so hard to get here, and now it seemed like he was on the verge of losing everything. That's when Ms. Lambert's words echoed in his mind. Leadership isn't just about taking charge. It's about finding your voice and using it to help others find theirs. He had been so focused on trying to stand out, to prove that he was capable of leading, that he had forgotten the most important part of leadership, listening. He had been so caught up in fighting for control that he hadn't stopped to listen to the needs of his group. Leadership wasn't just about being the loudest. It was about being a guide, a listener, and someone who could bring people together. The next time the group met, James knew he had to change his approach. Instead of trying to outshout Brian or force his ideas into the conversation, he decided to take a step back and listen to what the group needed. He observed their body language, listened to their concerns, and thought about what would actually make the project successful, not just for the competition, but for the community they were trying to serve. When it was his turn to speak, James started by acknowledging the strength of Brian's idea. He knew that Brian was passionate about technology, and that was valuable. But then he gently suggested they combine that with something that could also directly impact people's lives in a more immediate way. What if we used the technology to teach kids about something more practical, something that could help them right now? James asked, his voice steady. Maybe we could start a program that helps them learn financial literacy or teaches basic life skills, things that they can apply immediately. The room fell silent. Brian looked at him, clearly frustrated, but this time, James didn't back down. He continued, "It's not just about impressing the judges. It's about making sure the project we create actually helps people in a real, meaningful way." For the first time, James felt like he was being heard. There was a shift in the room, and others started to speak up, offering their thoughts on how they could combine both ideas. Slowly, they began to shape a new direction for their project, one that blended technology with real-world applications. Even Brian seemed to soften a little, nodding as the group started to come together around a shared vision. By the time they presented their final proposal, James felt a sense of pride he hadn't expected. The project was a blend of Brian's tech-driven idea and James' practical, community-focused approach. It wasn't perfect, but it was something that could actually make a difference, and that was all that mattered. As the judges reviewed their proposal, James felt a mix of nervousness and anticipation. They asked questions, listened to their answers, and seemed impressed by the team's ability to balance innovation with real-world impact. In the end, they didn't win the competition. But James didn't feel disappointed. The true victory had been in how his group had come together, how they had listened to each other and worked through their differences. He had found his voice again, not by trying to dominate the conversation, but by helping guide it towards something meaningful. It was a hard lesson, but one he would carry with him forever. Leadership wasn't about controlling the room, it was about creating space for others to contribute and finding ways to make their ideas stronger together. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. Have you ever faced a situation where you had to find your voice in a group? How did you handle it, and what did you learn from the experience? James had learned a lot in the past few days. The setback with the group project had taught him valuable lessons about listening, collaboration, and finding his voice in a room full of strong personalities. But just when he thought he had everything figured out, something unexpected happened. It was a Friday afternoon, and the students were gathered for the next big challenge. The entire program had been building up to this moment, an intense, week-long leadership exercise designed to push them to their limits. Emily stood in front of the group, her eyes sparkling with excitement as she introduced the task. "This is the leadership challenge," she said, her voice strong and clear. "You'll be working in new teams, facing a series of obstacles that will test everything you've learned so far: teamwork, communication, problem-solving, and resilience. But there's a twist: one of you will be assigned to lead each team, and you won't know who it is until the challenge begins." A collective murmur ran through the group. No one knew what to expect. James felt his stomach tighten. Was he going to be picked to lead? And if so, would he be able to handle it? As the teams were assigned, James found himself in a group with a few familiar faces: Brian, of course, but also Emily, one of the quieter students in the program who had impressed everyone with her calm demeanor and insightful ideas during previous challenges. Emily was someone James had quietly admired, though they hadn't had much chance to work closely together before. But what took James by surprise was the last person assigned to his team, his old classmate, Mr. Harris, the teacher who had mocked him during his first weeks in the program. Mr. Harris had never been kind to James. He was the teacher who had belittled him in class, made sarcastic remarks, and seemed to enjoy embarrassing him in front of others. Yet, here he was, assigned to James' team. James' heart sank. This was the last person he expected to work with, especially after everything that had happened between them. The thought of collaborating with Mr. Harris filled him with dread. Would he mock James again? Would he still see him as someone not worth listening to? Or worse, would he sabotage the challenge just to prove a point? The first day of the challenge was all about planning. Each team had to come up with a strategy to tackle the obstacle course and then pitch their plan to the leaders, who would evaluate them. Mr. Harris, as usual, seemed to take a back seat at first. He barely spoke during the planning session, letting Brian take the lead as usual. James noticed that Emily seemed to be quietly observing the group, waiting for her moment to contribute. She wasn't intimidated by Brian's loud voice or Mr. Harris's silence. When it was her turn to speak, she did so with quiet confidence. "I think we should approach this challenge as a team," she said calmly. "We need to think about our strengths and weaknesses, and build on those. I've noticed that James has a lot of great ideas when it comes to strategy, and I think we could really use that." James looked at her in surprise. Emily had recognized his abilities, and she was giving him the chance to take the lead. This wasn't just a small gesture, it was a lifeline. "I agree," James said, finding his voice. "We need to be strategic. It's not just about running through the obstacles quickly, it's about working together, using each of our strengths." Brian looked a little taken aback but didn't say anything. Mr. Harris, however, was still silent, watching the conversation unfold without offering much input. As the team began to work through their plan, James felt a growing sense of responsibility. He wasn't the designated leader, but Emily's support had given him the confidence to step up. Together, the team brainstormed, testing different strategies for the obstacle course. They worked well together, their ideas bouncing off each other, complementing one another's strengths. But as they continued, things started to get tense. Brian grew more and more frustrated, insisting that they needed to go faster and take more risks. He didn't seem to understand that speed wasn't the only thing that mattered. It was strategy, teamwork, and communication. "Come on, we don't have time for all these discussions," Brian snapped, slamming his fist on the table. "We need to act now, not waste time talking about it." James felt his frustration rise. It was the same attitude Brian had shown during the group project. He was always so quick to push forward without thinking through the consequences. James had learned his lesson about being reactive. It wasn't just about taking action, it was about making sure that action counted. "We're not wasting time," James said calmly, standing his ground. "We're being strategic. We need to think through every step before we move forward." Brian rolled his eyes but didn't argue further. Emily gave James an approving nod, and for a moment, James felt like they were actually starting to work as a team. That's when Mr. Harris spoke up, finally breaking his silence. "You're both right," he said quietly, surprising everyone. "Speed isn't the answer. Sometimes it's better to take a step back and reassess. You'll get farther that way." James was stunned. Mr. Harris, who had always been so dismissive, was now supporting him. It wasn't much, but it was a start. James had never expected this from Mr. Harris. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to him than James had thought. The next day, the team faced their first real test, an obstacle course that required them to climb, crawl, and navigate through various challenges. The course wasn't just physical, it tested their mental strength, communication, and ability to work under pressure. As they approached the first obstacle, a giant wall they had to scale, James took a deep breath. He wasn't the best climber, but he had to stay calm and focused. The team would have to rely on each other, and he had to lead them through it. Brian tried to take charge again, but this time, James stepped up. "Let's take it one step at a time," he said, looking at the group. "I'll go first and show you how to get to the top. Once I'm there, I'll help pull each of you up." He moved first, carefully scaling the wall and reaching the top. Once there, he extended his hand to the others, helping them up one by one. When it was Mr. Harris's turn, he hesitated. For a moment, James thought he might back out, but then Mr. Harris grabbed the rope and started climbing, taking it slow but steady. He made it to the top with James' help. At the top of the wall, Mr. Harris turned to James and gave him a small but genuine smile. It wasn't much, but it was a moment of recognition, an acknowledgement that James had earned his place in the team. By the time the challenge ended, James felt like he had not only grown as a leader but also gained an unexpected ally in Mr. Harris. He had never imagined that he would find common ground with the teacher who had mocked him, but in this moment, it felt like a new beginning. They hadn't won the challenge, but they had worked together, communicated, and supported each other. It was a victory in its own right. James realized that leadership wasn't just about having all the answers or being the loudest voice in the room, it was about collaboration, humility, and sometimes, learning from the people you least expect. James had learned so much over the past few weeks, about leadership, about teamwork, and, most importantly, about himself. He was starting to see the value in every experience, good or bad, and how each one brought him closer to understanding his true potential. But there was one thing he hadn't fully understood yet, his own power. The next challenge would push him to see just how far he could go, and how deep the strength within him really ran. It was a crisp Wednesday morning when Emily announced the surprise challenge. The group gathered around in the school's main hall, buzzing with excitement. Everyone assumed that this would be a routine leadership activity. What they didn't expect was that it would change everything. Emily stood at the front, holding a set of envelopes. Each one was marked with a name. She smiled as she called out the first name, James Roberts. James froze. His heart pounded in his chest, and his palms grew clammy. Was he about to be assigned something difficult? Something that would test everything he had learned? Emily's eyes were warm, but there was a hint of challenge in them as well. "James, you're going to lead a one-on-one mentorship program today. Your task is to mentor another student in a leadership exercise, and you'll need to guide them through it." The group fell silent. James wasn't sure what Emily meant by leadership exercise, but the fact that he was being chosen to mentor someone felt like a huge responsibility. He had barely started feeling confident about leading groups. How was he supposed to mentor someone else? Emily handed him the envelope with the name of the student he would be mentoring. "Your partner is Brian," she said with a grin. James blinked in disbelief. He was supposed to mentor Brian. The same Brian who had always bulldozed his way through every group project. The same Brian who had shut down James' ideas at every turn. This was an ironic twist. As James glanced around the room, he saw Brian standing off to the side, arms crossed, clearly not pleased with the pairing either. But neither of them could back out. This was the challenge. The first few minutes of their mentorship session were awkward. Brian wasn't exactly thrilled about being mentored by James. He had a smug look on his face, as if to say, "What could James possibly teach me?" "Let's just get this over with," Brian said, barely making eye contact. James took a deep breath and tried to keep his calm. He was determined to make the most of this opportunity, not just for Brian's benefit, but for his own. This could be the moment where he could demonstrate everything he had learned about leadership. "Okay," James began, trying to sound confident. "We're going to do a leadership exercise that focuses on active listening and collaboration. First, we'll have a discussion, and you'll practice listening carefully to what I say without interrupting." Brian snorted. "You've got to be kidding me." James didn't let it throw him off. He pressed on, determined to make this work. "The point of this exercise is to see how well we can communicate and work together without dominating the conversation. It's about learning to value each other's ideas. They began the exercise. At first, it was difficult. Brian would interrupt with his usual dismissive comments or try to steer the conversation towards something that interested him. But James, drawing on everything he had learned so far, didn't let Brian's attitude distract him. He kept calm, listened, and allowed space for Brian to speak. And gradually, something unexpected happened. Brian stopped interrupting. It didn't happen all at once, but slowly, he began to listen. At first, it was just small moments, a pause before speaking, a glance of acknowledgement as James made a point. The more Brian listened, the more he began to understand the value of what James was saying. About halfway through the exercise, James made a deliberate choice. He knew that Brian's arrogance often came from a place of insecurity. James had realized that the best way to break through to Brian was not to challenge him head-on, but to give him the chance to feel heard. He took a moment to ask Brian something personal. What's something you've always wanted to do but felt like you couldn't? Something that really matters to you, not just for show. Brian stiffened, clearly taken aback by the question. For a moment, he said nothing. James had expected this. After all, Brian was the kind of person who liked to keep his emotions under wraps. But then, to James' surprise, Brian spoke quietly. I always wanted to be a writer. I don't know. I just never thought I could actually make it. James felt his chest tighten with empathy. This was the side of Brian that no one had seen before. The side that wasn't the loud, arrogant alpha, but the vulnerable, thoughtful person underneath. Why don't you give it a shot? James asked, his voice gentle. You don't have to be perfect right away. But you should try. I think you'd be good at it. For the first time in this entire experience, Brian didn't have a sarcastic comeback. He just nodded, looking down at his hands for a long moment. The rest of the session went smoother after that. Brian seemed to relax, opening up more than James had ever expected. He began contributing his own ideas to the exercise, and while he didn't suddenly become a model student, he started to change. It was small, almost imperceptible at first, but James noticed it. By the time the exercise was over, James was stunned. He had mentored Brian, and Brian had actually listened. More importantly, he had revealed a part of himself that no one had seen before. After the exercise ended, Emily came over to check in on the group. She watched them for a moment, noticing the shift in Brian's attitude. Well done, James, she said, smiling. I knew you had it in you. James wasn't sure what Emily meant by that, but he didn't need to ask. The experience had been enough of a revelation for him. Later that evening, Brian approached James quietly. Thanks, he said, almost awkwardly. For what you said. I've always thought I had to be perfect, to impress people. But I guess, maybe I was wrong. James nodded, a little surprised by the apology. It's all about taking chances, Brian. No one expects you to be perfect. Just keep trying. Brian looked at him for a moment longer, his expression unreadable. Then, for the first time in a long time, he gave James a small, genuine smile. James couldn't believe it. He had mentored Brian, and for the first time, it felt like they understood each other. The process had been slow and challenging, but in the end, it had worked. The exercise had forced James to confront his own beliefs about leadership, that it wasn't just about being the best or always being in charge, but about helping others realize their own potential. James realized that his own genius wasn't just about solving problems or taking charge in a group, it was about connecting with others, seeing beyond their flaws, and helping them see the best in themselves. As he walked home that evening, James couldn't help but feel like he had finally unlocked something inside himself. It wasn't about being perfect or being the loudest voice in the room. It was about recognizing the potential in others, and in doing so, realizing his own. After the unexpected breakthrough with Brian, James felt like a different person. It wasn't just that he had learned more about leadership or that he had been able to help Brian discover a hidden side of himself, it was deeper than that. James had learned that real change, both in others and in himself, often came from the most unlikely places. He also realized that leadership wasn't just about guiding others through challenges, but about embracing vulnerability, honesty, and growth. But even with these lessons, things were about to take another turn, one that would test James' resolve like never before. The weeks following the mentorship exercise had been filled with excitement and growth. The group had continued to work through complex tasks, learning new skills and navigating the dynamics between different personalities. Yet despite all the progress James was making, there was something that had been quietly building in the background: Mr. Harris. The teacher, who had once mocked James and acted as an obstacle to his growth, seemed to be more of a presence now. At first, James thought it was just his own paranoia. After all, he had worked so hard to prove himself. Did it really matter what Mr. Harris thought anymore? But the more he reflected, the more it seemed like Mr. Harris was actively undermining him. It wasn't anything overt or dramatic, just little comments here and there. During group discussions, Mr. Harris would always direct his questions toward others, barely acknowledging James when he spoke. In team activities, he would look at James' ideas with skepticism, yet when anyone else suggested something, he would nod thoughtfully, as if they were revelations. James had tried to let it go. He had tried to focus on his own progress, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Harris still saw him as an outsider, someone who wasn't worthy of being listened to. One day, during a leadership exercise that required each student to come up with a solution to a complex problem, Mr. Harris took it one step further. James had put a lot of thought into his solution, and when he presented it to the group, he felt confident that it was solid. But as he spoke, he noticed Mr. Harris shaking his head, not even looking at him as he made his points. When it was James' turn to explain his reasoning, Mr. Harris interrupted him sharply. "James, I'm not sure you're seeing the whole picture here. Your solution might sound good, but it's missing some critical elements. I would suggest you rethink your approach." The word stung, and the way Mr. Harris spoke made it clear that he wasn't offering constructive criticism. He was belittling James in front of the entire group. The rest of the class fell silent. Even Brian, who had been more open lately, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. It was as if the air had thickened, the weight of the moment settling in. James could feel his hands tremble slightly, his heart racing. This wasn't just about a challenge anymore. It was about something deeper. It was about proving to himself that he was worthy of respect, even if it wasn't given to him. James could feel the familiar fire burning inside him. He wasn't going to let Mr. Harris get away with this, not anymore. The old James would have just swallowed the humiliation and moved on, quietly accepting the role of the underdog. But not this time. This time, he would fight for what he believed in. With a calm that surprised even him, James stood tall and faced Mr. Harris. "I appreciate the feedback, Mr. Harris," he said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. "But I disagree. My solution is sound, and here's why." He went on to explain his reasoning, articulating every step of his plan with clarity and conviction. The more he spoke, the more his confidence grew. He wasn't just speaking to Mr. Harris. He was speaking to everyone in the room, including himself. As James finished, he looked around the room. There was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. Some students exchanged glances, while others nodded in silent approval. Even Brian, who had been a skeptic, seemed to be considering James' words. Mr. Harris, on the other hand, didn't say a word. He simply nodded curtly, a flicker of something like respect, or perhaps something deeper, in his eyes. It was a small victory, but it meant everything to James. He had stood his ground, and in doing so, had proven to himself that he didn't need anyone's validation to know his worth. The challenge wasn't over, but the battle within James had been won. He had faced his doubts, confronted his fears, and taken a stand against the one person who had constantly made him feel inferior. For the first time in a long while, James truly understood what it meant to believe in himself. But the journey wasn't over yet. There were still obstacles to face, and more lessons to learn. The road to leadership was filled with twists and turns, and James knew that his greatest challenges were still ahead. That night, as he lay in bed, he thought about the day's events. For the first time, he didn't feel small in the shadow of someone else's authority. He felt like he had carved out his own space, like he had found his voice in a world that had often tried to silence him. It was a powerful realization, and James knew that the best was yet to come. After his stand against Mr. Harris, James felt both invigorated and conflicted. It was as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders, but there was also a growing sense of unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that his actions hadn't gone unnoticed, especially by those who had always doubted him. Mr. Harris, in particular, seemed to be simmering beneath his stoic exterior. James didn't know what to expect next, but he was ready to face whatever came his way. As the days passed, the unease only grew. The tension between James and Mr. Harris became palpable. The teacher's subtle jabs and dismissive gestures were getting harder to ignore. The problem was, James wasn't the only one who had noticed it. His friends, especially Emily, had begun to pick up on it too. One afternoon, as the group gathered for a leadership debrief after a challenging group activity, Emily pulled James aside. "Hey," she said quietly, "I know things have been a little tense between you and Mr. Harris. I just want you to know, I've got your back. If he's making you feel uncomfortable or, well, undermining you, I'll step in." James hesitated, looking over at Mr. Harris, who was standing by the chalkboard, engaged in conversation with another teacher. "I appreciate it, Emily. But I think I need to handle this on my own. I don't want to make it a bigger issue than it already is." Emily gave him a concerned look, but she didn't press him further. "Just remember, we're all here for you. You don't have to face this alone." Her words felt comforting, but James couldn't shake the feeling that a storm was brewing. The issue wasn't just Mr. Harris anymore, it was about his place in this world, about his own belief in his worth. He had spent so long feeling like an outsider, like someone who had to prove himself at every turn. But this wasn't just about proving his value to others, it was about proving it to himself. The following week, James' resolve was tested once again. It started innocuously enough, another leadership activity, another round of feedback from Mr. Harris. But this time, something about the interaction was different. The tone in Mr. Harris's voice was sharper, more pointed. The comments weren't just about James' work, they were about his ability to even be part of the discussion. "You're not seeing the bigger picture, James," Mr. Harris said, his voice laced with condescension. "Leadership isn't just about having a good idea, it's about being able to execute it with precision. And you're still struggling with that." The words felt like daggers. James' fists clenched at his sides, but he fought to keep his composure. He had learned to let go of anger, to rise above the insults. But today, something inside him snapped. "No, Mr. Harris," James said, his voice calm but firm. "Leadership is about more than just execution. It's about inspiring others, empowering them to believe in themselves. I might not be perfect, but I am learning, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to get better. I'm not here to impress you or anyone else. I'm here to grow." The room fell silent. Mr. Harris looked at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. For a brief second, James thought he had gone too far. But then, something strange happened. Mr. Harris didn't respond with anger or defensiveness. He didn't belittle James or make another comment about his abilities. Instead, he simply nodded, as if acknowledging that James had a point. "Well," Mr. Harris said after a pause, his tone slightly softer, "maybe you're right. Keep working on it, James. Let's see how you progress." It wasn't a victory, but it was a shift. James had made a stand, not just for himself, but for what he believed in. He realized that leadership wasn't just about controlling a situation, it was about changing the way others saw it. It was about changing the narrative. Despite the brief moment of clarity with Mr. Harris, James knew the battle wasn't over. There were still moments of tension, still whispers in the halls. But what struck him the most was how much he had changed. The old James would have folded, let the pressure crush him, and given in to the idea that he wasn't good enough. But now, James felt something new inside him, strength, resolve, and a sense of purpose. Emily noticed it too. "You're different," she said one day after a particularly challenging group activity. "I've been watching you, and there's something about you now, like you've finally figured it out." James smiled slightly. "Maybe I have." She grinned, raising an eyebrow. "Don't get too cocky. We still have a lot to prove." James laughed. "I know. But I'm ready. I'm ready to do what it takes." As time went on, James found himself stepping into a new role within the group. He wasn't just the outsider anymore. He wasn't the kid who had to prove himself at every turn. People started coming to him for advice, seeking out his guidance on various challenges. Even Brian, who had once doubted him at every step, had started to see him in a new light. But there was something even deeper happening inside James. He wasn't just a better leader now, he was a more authentic version of himself. He had stopped trying to fit into other people's expectations and had started focusing on what truly mattered, his own growth and the growth of those around him. James was starting to realize that leadership wasn't about accolades or recognition. It was about influence. It was about being the kind of person who inspired others to be better, not just through words, but through actions. And that was a kind of power that no one could take away. But there were still challenges ahead. James knew this. He knew that Mr. Harris wouldn't suddenly become his biggest fan. He knew that there would still be moments of doubt, still times when people would question his worth. But what had changed was James' belief in himself. He had learned to trust his own judgment, to take pride in his journey, and to stay true to his values. And with that belief came something even more powerful, hope. Hope that he could continue to grow, continue to lead, and continue to inspire, not just others, but himself. James had come a long way from the self-doubting boy who had once struggled to even find his voice. But the road ahead was still long, and he was ready for it. The tension that had been simmering for weeks now seemed to finally reach its boiling point. James had fought hard to carve out his place in this new world of leadership and self-discovery. He had stood up to Mr. Harris, earned the respect of his peers, and proven to himself that he was capable of much more than he had ever thought. But now, it was time for a different kind of challenge, one that would test his ability to collaborate, to see beyond his own experiences and truly understand the people around him. James wasn't used to depending on others. Growing up, he'd always been the kind of person who figured things out on his own. He'd learned early that if you wanted something done right, you had to do it yourself. But leadership was about more than that. It was about empowering others, lifting them up, and recognizing that success didn't have to come at the expense of those around you. And as James continued to lead, he began to realize that he couldn't do everything alone. The next big project the class was given was a group-based leadership challenge that would span several weeks. James found himself paired with some of the students who had always seemed distant or even dismissive toward him. One of them was Rachel, a sharp but often sarcastic student who had always kept to herself. Another was Derek, a quiet but brilliant student who often flew under the radar. At first, the dynamic was awkward. There was a clear divide between the students who had always been in the popular group and those who had been more on the outskirts. James knew that if this project was going to succeed, they had to break through the barriers that had kept them apart for so long. "I'm not really the group project type," Rachel said one afternoon as they gathered to discuss their plan. "I work better alone." James didn't take offense. He understood her reluctance, after all, he'd felt the same way not too long ago. "I get it," he said. "But if we're going to make this work, we need to trust each other. We all bring something different to the table. Derek, who had been mostly silent, spoke up for the first time. I can help with the research, he said quietly. I'm good at finding patterns and solutions. I don't mind doing the work if it helps the team. James smiled, recognizing the value in Derek's approach. That's perfect. I'm good with ideas and strategies, but I need someone who can back them up with real data. Rachel, what about you? Rachel crossed her arms, clearly skeptical. I can organize everything, she said. But don't expect me to do anything extra. It wasn't the most enthusiastic response, but it was a start. James nodded. Great. We've got a plan. Now let's work together to make it happen. Over the next few days, James worked hard to create an environment of cooperation within the group. He encouraged everyone to share their ideas, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. He asked Derek for input on how to back up their ideas with solid evidence, and Rachel began to take more ownership of the organizational aspects, creating detailed plans for each part of the project. At times, the group dynamic was still rocky. Rachel would make sarcastic comments, and Derek's silence would make things feel even more tense. But James had learned something important during his own journey: you didn't need to agree on everything to be effective as a team. What mattered was mutual respect, open communication, and a willingness to adapt. As the project progressed, Rachel started to open up a bit more. She shared some of her personal struggles, how she had always felt like an outsider, and how she was afraid of being vulnerable in front of others. Derek, too, began to speak more, explaining his love for solving complex problems and how he often kept to himself because he found it easier to work alone. James listened. He didn't offer advice or try to fix their problems, he just let them talk. And in doing so, he earned their trust. Slowly but surely, the group began to click. They became a team, not just because of their shared goal, but because they had begun to understand each other on a deeper level. It was late one evening, just a few days before their presentation, when the breakthrough finally came. The group had been struggling to bring all their research together into a cohesive plan. There were too many ideas, too many opinions, and no clear way to tie them all together. James felt the pressure mounting. He didn't want to let his group down, and he could feel the weight of their expectations. But instead of falling into panic mode, he took a deep breath and looked around the room at his teammates. "We've got this," he said, his voice steady. "Let's take a step back and think about the big picture. What's the core of our solution?" Rachel raised her eyebrows. "You mean, stop trying to make everything perfect?" James nodded. "Exactly. Sometimes, the best way forward is to simplify things. We've all been working so hard to make this idea flawless that we've forgotten what we're really trying to achieve. We need to focus on the heart of the solution, what will truly impact our audience." Derek, who had been staring at his notes in silence, suddenly spoke up. "We need a compelling story. A narrative that pulls everything together." It was a simple idea, but it was exactly what they had been missing. The project wasn't just about research or data, it was about communicating a vision, about telling a story that people could connect with. In that moment, everything clicked. The group came together, pooling their ideas and resources, crafting a presentation that was not only informative but also emotionally resonant. They had found a way to connect the technical with the human, the logical with the creative. And it was powerful. On the day of the presentation, the group stood before the class, nervous but proud. James could feel the energy in the room, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. But this time, he didn't feel alone. He had the support of his team, the people who had once been distant, now standing beside him as equals. As they presented their project, James could see the difference in how their classmates responded. The room was engaged, listening intently as they shared their story. And when it was over, the applause was genuine. It wasn't just the success of the project that they were celebrating, it was the success of the team. Mr. Harris, who had been silent throughout the presentation, finally spoke. "Well done. You've all worked hard, and it shows." James couldn't help but smile. It wasn't just a win for the group, it was a win for him, too. He had learned something invaluable in this experience, that leadership wasn't about doing everything on your own, but about fostering an environment where everyone could shine. As the class wrapped up, James found himself reflecting on how far he had come. He wasn't the same person who had walked into the class weeks ago, unsure of his place and doubting his worth. Now, he had learned to trust others, to see their potential, and to recognize that leadership wasn't about taking all the credit, it was about lifting others up. And as he stood there, surrounded by his teammates, he realized something important: leadership wasn't a destination. It was a journey. And he was just getting started. James had always been someone who preferred action over words. He was a thinker, a doer, and for the longest time, he believed that the best way to make a change was by proving himself through hard work and success. But after the leadership project with Rachel, Derek, and Emily, he was starting to understand something deeper about leadership. It wasn't just about being great, it was about inspiring others to believe in themselves, too. And that, more than anything, required words. James hadn't realized how much his words could affect those around him until that moment. It was during their final presentation of the group project. As they stood before the class, sharing their findings and what they had learned, James found himself speaking with more conviction than he had ever thought possible. When he spoke, it wasn't just about the work they had done, it was about why it mattered. It was about why leadership, teamwork, and belief in each other could change the way they approached the world. He didn't expect it to be a life-changing moment for anyone. But what happened afterward shook him to his core. "James," Rachel said, approaching him after class, "I just wanted to say thank you. I've never heard anyone speak like that before. You really made me rethink some things. About how I see myself. About how I see other people." James smiled, surprised by her words. "I'm glad it made an impact," he said, trying to keep his cool. "I just spoke from the heart." "I can tell," she replied, nodding. "And I think I'll carry that with me. Maybe I don't always have to do everything on my own. Maybe I can open up and trust others more." Derek, who had been standing silently behind Rachel, gave James a small nod. "Yeah, man. That was good. You made me realize that maybe I should start speaking up more, too. I've been keeping to myself for too long." The realization hit James all at once: words could be as powerful as actions. What he said had the ability to transform people. To open doors, to break down walls, to change lives. For the first time in a long time, James understood the weight of what he said, not just to prove his point, but to lift others up. Over the next few weeks, James began to feel a shift. He wasn't just a leader by title or by role anymore. He was becoming a leader by influence. People started turning to him not just for help with assignments, but for advice on life. He was surprised to see how many of his classmates were struggling with things they hadn't shared with anyone: insecurities, doubts, fears of failure. And while James was still learning how to be vulnerable himself, he realized that by sharing his own journey, by being honest about his own challenges and setbacks, he was helping others feel seen. One afternoon, during lunch, Emily came over to sit with him. Her expression was serious, her usual upbeat energy replaced with a quiet intensity. "James, there's something I've been thinking about. It's something I want to talk to you about," she said, glancing around the cafeteria as if to make sure no one else was listening. "Of course, what's up?" James asked, setting his tray aside and giving her his full attention. "I've noticed a lot of people, including you, have been stepping up lately. You're all taking leadership roles in ways that surprise me," she said. "But I feel like there's one person who's been left behind." James frowned. "Who?" "Mr. Harris," Emily said quietly, looking directly at James. "He's been different. Since you spoke out in that group project, it's like he's been cold toward everyone. I'm not saying it's just you, but I think he's holding something against you. James felt a tight knot form in his stomach. What do you mean? Emily lowered her voice further. I don't know. But ever since that day in class when you called him out, it's like he's been trying to push you and everyone else to the limit. He's been more critical, more demanding, and I'm worried about what might happen next. James sat back, the weight of her words settling over him. He had been so focused on his own growth, on leading his peers, that he hadn't considered how Mr. Harris might react to his newfound voice. But it made sense now. He had challenged the teacher in a way that no one else had, and it seemed Mr. Harris hadn't taken kindly to that. Well, James said, his voice calm but firm, I'm not going to back down. I can't. Not now. Not after everything I've learned. Emily nodded slowly. I know you won't. But just be careful. It might be worth having a conversation with him. You know, to clear the air. James appreciated Emily's advice, but part of him felt like confronting Mr. Harris directly might just escalate things. Still, he knew that the next time they had an interaction, he would have to be prepared to handle it with maturity and respect. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore, he was fighting for the principles he had learned through all of this. As the weeks passed, the atmosphere in the classroom became even more charged. Mr. Harris had taken every opportunity to scrutinize James, and his comments became sharper, more cutting. But James refused to let it get to him. He had seen enough to know that this wasn't about him, it was about Mr. Harris's own insecurities, his unwillingness to be challenged by a student like James. But as much as James had learned about leadership, about standing firm in his beliefs, there were still moments when the pressure felt overwhelming. He started questioning whether the fight was even worth it. Was it possible to change someone like Mr. Harris? Or was he just spinning his wheels? It was on one of these quiet, self-doubting days that James received a message from Emily that shifted his perspective. James, the text read, I think it's time you took control of this situation once and for all. Don't let him get away with trying to intimidate you. You've grown so much already, now it's time to show everyone, including Mr. Harris, that you are the leader of your own story. Those words, simple but empowering, gave James the strength he needed. Emily was right. He had worked too hard to let someone like Mr. Harris take away his confidence. It was time to confront the issue head-on, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever felt dismissed or undervalued. The day James had been anticipating had finally arrived. He stood at the front of the classroom, his heart beating in his chest. The pressure was mounting. Mr. Harris had called the class together for a special meeting. James had no idea what it was about, but deep down, he knew it wasn't just a routine class discussion. James had been feeling the weight of his interactions with Mr. Harris ever since the leadership project. The teacher's comments had grown increasingly harsh, and James couldn't help but feel that Mr. Harris was targeting him. The tension between them had become palpable, so much so that even the other students had begun to notice. James' classmates whispered behind his back, speculating on what was happening. They knew something was up, but none of them had the courage to ask Mr. Harris directly. The stakes were too high, and no one wanted to risk their position in class by challenging the teacher. But James had learned that sometimes, the only way to move forward was to face the conflict head-on. The bell rang, signaling the start of class. James took a deep breath as Mr. Harris entered the room, his usual stern expression more intense than usual. As the students settled into their seats, James felt the eyes of his peers on him. Everyone was curious, waiting for whatever confrontation might unfold. Mr. Harris stood at the front of the room and cleared his throat, addressing the class. Today, we'll be discussing leadership and responsibility, he began, his voice cold and professional. However, this isn't just about theory, it's about actions. And some people, it seems, need a reminder of that. James felt his stomach churn. He knew the comment was aimed at him. The implication hung in the air like a heavy cloud, and he could feel his classmates shift uncomfortably in their seats. James raised his hand. The room fell silent. "Mr. Harris," James said, his voice steady but filled with conviction, "I think it's important to address the way this class has been going. I've noticed that there's been a shift in how we're being treated, especially since the leadership project. It seems like you've been more critical toward some of us, and I believe we need to clear the air." The room was dead quiet. Even Mr. Harris seemed taken aback by James' boldness. He narrowed his eyes at the student, as if trying to read him. "What do you mean, James?" he asked, his voice tinged with sarcasm. James stood tall. He wasn't going to back down. "It's obvious. You've been targeting me since the project. I get that I challenged you in front of the class, but that doesn't give you the right to treat me differently, or anyone else for that matter. This is about respect. You're a teacher, and we're your students. We're here to learn, not to be belittled." The words hung in the air, and James could feel the entire class watching him. His classmates were starting to stir, some exchanging glances, while others looked at James with a mix of admiration and concern. This wasn't just a conversation anymore. It was a reckoning. Mr. Harris was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on James. He wasn't used to students speaking to him like this. He had always been in control of his classroom, and James' words were a direct challenge to that control. Finally, Mr. Harris spoke, his voice low but filled with a quiet anger. "You think you understand what it means to be a leader, James? Leadership is not about making bold statements or defying authority. It's about following the rules and knowing your place." James' eyes narrowed. Respect isn't about following rules blindly. It's about treating people with dignity, no matter who they are or where they come from. Leadership is about recognizing potential in others, not about shutting them down. The exchange between the two men was escalating quickly. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. James could feel his classmates' eyes on him, but he didn't care. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about every student in that classroom who had ever felt overlooked or dismissed. It was about showing them that they didn't have to tolerate mistreatment. "James, you're out of line," Mr. Harris said, his voice sharp. "You've overstepped your boundaries." "I don't think I have," James responded, his tone firm but respectful. "But you might be right about one thing, I'm starting to realize that some boundaries need to be challenged. Sometimes, the system is flawed, and that's something we all need to recognize. Including you." James knew the stakes. He could sense the subtle shift in the classroom dynamic. Some students were uneasy, glancing around nervously, not wanting to get involved. Others, however, were beginning to look at James with something different in their eyes, something resembling support. Rachel, who had been unusually quiet until now, spoke up. "James is right," she said, her voice carrying more weight than usual. "We've all noticed the way Mr. Harris has been treating us, and it's not okay." Derek, who rarely spoke, added, "I agree. We're here to learn, and we can't do that if we feel like we're being judged and criticized all the time." For a moment, there was an awkward silence, but then Emily nodded in agreement. "It's about time someone said something." It was like a domino effect. One by one, more and more students began speaking up. Some shared their frustrations with Mr. Harris's teaching style, while others expressed how they felt dismissed or ignored in the classroom. James stood there, feeling a wave of support that he had never expected. He wasn't just standing up for himself anymore. He was standing up for everyone who had ever felt marginalized or unheard. Mr. Harris looked around the room, his face reddening. He hadn't expected this. For the first time, he was the one being challenged, and it shook him. "I'm not going to tolerate insubordination," Mr. Harris said, his voice cracking with anger. "This behavior will not be tolerated, James. You're skating on thin ice." But James wasn't afraid anymore. "I'm not insubordinate, Mr. Harris. I'm speaking up. And I'm not going to be quiet just because you don't like what I have to say." The room held its breath. For a long moment, there was a standoff between James and Mr. Harris. Finally, Mr. Harris broke the silence. "Enough," he said coldly. "This conversation is over. We'll discuss this further at another time." James didn't respond. He had said what he needed to say. He had challenged the system, and now it was up to everyone else to decide how they would move forward. After class, James could feel the weight of what had just happened. He had challenged a teacher in front of the entire class, something that no one had dared to do before. But instead of feeling fear or regret, James felt a sense of relief. He had spoken his truth. And even if it had caused a rift, he knew that what he had done was necessary. As he walked out of the classroom, Emily, Rachel, and Derek joined him. They didn't say anything at first, but the shared understanding between them was clear. "You did good, James," Rachel said quietly. "Yeah," Derek added. "You stood up for all of us." James smiled. "It wasn't just me. It was all of us. We all deserve respect, and it's time we demand it." The days following the confrontation with Mr. Harris were quiet. Tension still hung in the air like a heavy fog, but the classroom had shifted. People were talking more openly about what had happened, and it felt like a weight had been lifted off their shoulders. James had stood up for something important, and the ripple effect was undeniable. It was clear that James' actions had sparked something within his classmates. The way Mr. Harris had been treating them, his harsh, critical demeanor, had gone unchecked for far too long. But now, with James calling it out, the students felt emboldened. They were talking to each other more, sharing their frustrations, and it was like they finally had a voice. Rachel, Emily, and Derek were the first to reach out to James after the incident. They approached him during lunch, sitting down with him at the usual spot in the cafeteria. James could feel the energy was different this time. There was a shared sense of empowerment among them. "You know, James," Rachel began, "what you did took guts. I think it made people realize they don't have to stay quiet anymore. They can stand up for themselves." "Yeah, it wasn't just you challenging Mr. Harris," Derek said. "It was all of us challenging this whole system. We don't have to just take whatever we're given." Emily nodded in agreement. "Exactly. We're allowed to demand respect, and now that we've seen that it's possible, we're all starting to think about what else we've been putting up with." James smiled, a sense of warmth spreading through him. He hadn't realized just how much his actions had resonated with the others. He thought it was just a moment of personal rebellion, but now he could see that it had turned into something much bigger, a shift in the way his classmates saw themselves. "I never thought I'd be the one to get this kind of response," James admitted, feeling a bit overwhelmed by it all. "I mean, I thought it was just me against Mr. Harris. But now, it feels like we're all in this together." "It's because you showed us it's possible," Rachel said. "And now, we all want to stand up for what's right." James didn't know what was coming next, but in that moment, he felt a deep sense of purpose. His journey had started with him simply wanting to get through school and do well, but now he realized that it was about more than that. It was about making sure everyone had the opportunity to succeed, no matter their background or their struggles. The next day, as James walked into class, he noticed something different. Mr. Harris wasn't in the classroom yet, and there was a sense of anticipation in the air. The students were more talkative than usual, and there was an odd undercurrent of excitement. When Mr. Harris finally arrived, he didn't look as stern as he had the past few weeks. In fact, there was something almost reluctant in his posture. He cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. "I've had time to think," he said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "About what happened the other day. I realize now that I may have overreacted." James could feel his heart pounding. Was Mr. Harris actually apologizing? "I've been hard on all of you, and for that, I'm sorry," Mr. Harris continued. "I let my ego get in the way of my teaching. I'm here to help you all grow, not to tear you down." The class was stunned. It was unlike anything anyone had expected. For a teacher like Mr. Harris, known for his pride and his tough demeanor, this was a huge admission. James, however, wasn't sure what to say. He had expected resistance, not humility. "Thank you for saying that, Mr. Harris," James replied cautiously. "I think we all needed to hear it." Mr. Harris nodded, his gaze meeting James. "I've been teaching for a long time, and it's easy to get caught up in the rules and the structure. But I need to remember that teaching is about the students, not just about the subject matter." It was a moment of rare vulnerability from a man who had always kept his emotions tightly guarded. James didn't know if this was a permanent change, but it felt like a turning point. Mr. Harris wasn't the same man he had been before. He had been forced to reflect on his actions, and that wasn't something to take lightly. The shift in Mr. Harris's demeanor didn't just change the way he treated James, it affected everyone in the class. There was a noticeable decrease in the tension that had once been so thick in the air. The classroom felt lighter, less hostile. The students seemed more willing to engage, and there was a renewed sense of respect in the room. James continued to be a quiet leader in the class, but he noticed something important. His classmates, who had once been passive, were starting to take ownership of their learning. They were more involved, more vocal, and more confident in sharing their thoughts and opinions. As the days passed, James also found that he was changing in subtle ways. He no longer felt the need to prove himself to anyone. Instead, he focused on helping others find their own voices. His leadership style had evolved from being driven by personal ambition to being driven by a desire to uplift those around him. He realized that leadership wasn't just about getting to the top, it was about bringing others along with you. It wasn't just Mr. Harris who had changed. The whole class had gone through a transformation. The dynamics were shifting, and James could see it in the way his peers interacted with each other. There was a new sense of camaraderie and understanding. They weren't just classmates anymore, they were a team. And while James knew that not everything would be perfect from here on out, he felt a deep sense of pride in how far they had come. That afternoon, as he sat with Rachel, Derek, and Emily, he couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed in such a short time. "You know," James said, looking around at his friends, "this is bigger than just us. What we've done in this class, it's a message. A message that we don't have to accept things the way they are. We can change the system. We can make it better." Emily smiled. "You've definitely made an impact, James. And I think we all realize now that we have a lot more power than we thought." James nodded. "We do. And it's only just beginning." The weeks following James' bold confrontation with Mr. Harris had been transformative for everyone. There was a palpable shift in the air. Not only was Mr. Harris more mindful of his approach, but the entire class had begun to embrace a new sense of unity and empowerment. But just as things were starting to settle into a new normal, an unexpected challenge arose that threatened to undo everything James had worked for. It was the middle of the semester when Mr. Harris introduced a new class project, one that would determine the final grade for the leadership unit. The announcement came as a shock to the students, and James could feel the collective tension build once again. "This project will require you to work in groups," Mr. Harris announced, his usual stern expression back in place. "Each group will be responsible for creating a presentation on leadership within a historical context. You'll need to show how the principles of leadership apply to real-world events. Your group's success will depend on your ability to work together and demonstrate your understanding." James exchanged looks with Rachel, Emily, and Derek. The project sounded simple enough, but there was one problem. Mr. Harris had already divided the class into groups, something that immediately made James uneasy. He knew that in previous years, Mr. Harris would often assign students to groups based on personality dynamics that favored those he deemed favorites. And based on how things had gone between them, James was almost certain he wouldn't end up in a group that was treated equally. The groups were announced, and as expected, James was placed with a few students who weren't exactly known for being engaged in class. He was with Kyle, a quiet kid who kept to himself, and Alicia, who had always seemed distant and uninterested in anything that didn't concern her. On the other side of the room, Rachel, Derek, and Emily were placed together, a group of highly motivated and outspoken students. James felt the sting of isolation immediately. As the bell rang and students began filing out of the room, Rachel caught James' eye. She approached him quietly, a look of concern on her face. "Hey, James," she said softly. "I know it's not ideal, but don't let it throw you off. You've got this. We're still here for you, okay?" James nodded, feeling a mix of gratitude and frustration. "Thanks, Rachel. I just don't want to deal with this kind of thing again, you know. It feels like we're back to square one." Rachel smiled, a comforting smile that made James feel like everything would be okay. "You've already made a huge difference. We all know that." Over the next few days, James tried his best to push his frustration aside. He knew that if he wanted to succeed, he had to focus on the task at hand, regardless of how the group was formed. But it wasn't easy. Kyle, while quiet and reserved, had an analytical mind. He often kept to himself but seemed to have a good grasp of the historical elements of the project. Alicia, however, remained disengaged and frequently seemed more concerned with texting or doodling than contributing. James tried to engage both of them, suggesting ideas and splitting tasks, but Alicia remained distant, and Kyle seemed to prefer working alone. James could feel the pressure mounting. His classmates, especially Rachel's group, were working cohesively and efficiently. It was hard not to compare his own progress with theirs. James had always been the type of person who thrived on teamwork and collaboration. But with his current group, it felt like he was fighting an uphill battle. As the deadline for the project approached, James found himself stuck in an exhausting cycle of trying to motivate his group members. He stayed up late researching and preparing, hoping that Alicia and Kyle would pull through, but every time he tried to check in with them, they seemed uninterested. It was becoming clear to him that his group was failing, and he was the only one trying to hold it together. One afternoon, as the class came together to review their progress, James could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him. Mr. Harris was walking around, observing each group's development. When he arrived at James' table, he stopped cold. "So, James," Mr. Harris said, raising an eyebrow, "how's your group doing? It looks like not much progress has been made here." James' heart sank. "We're getting there," he said, forcing a smile. "It's just been a little harder to get everyone on the same page." Mr. Harris's gaze hardened. "That's what I thought. A leader is only as good as their team, James. If you can't lead your group to success, then maybe you're not the leader you think you are." The word stung, more than James wanted to admit. But in that moment, he knew that Mr. Harris was trying to break him. This was a test, not just of his leadership skills, but of his resolve. And James wasn't about to back down. "Maybe," James replied coolly, meeting Mr. Harris's gaze, "but a leader also knows when it's time to take control of a situation. And I'm not going to let this group fail because of a few people who don't want to put in the work." Mr. Harris didn't respond. He simply nodded and walked away, his expression unreadable. But James knew this was far from over. The weight of the project and the pressure of proving himself in front of Mr. Harris were only beginning. That night, after another late study session, James was ready to give up. It felt like everything was falling apart. His group wasn't cooperating, and the project was a mess. It seemed like no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't get everyone to pull their weight. But then, as he sat in his room staring at the scattered notes and half-done work in front of him, a thought struck him. If he was going to get this project back on track, he couldn't keep waiting for Kyle and Alicia to step up. He had to take charge, fully and completely. It wasn't just about finishing the project, it was about showing everyone, including Mr. Harris, that he could lead through adversity. James pulled out his phone and texted Alicia and Kyle, telling them that they needed to meet the next day after school. He laid out the plan: they would work through the remaining tasks together, and he wouldn't leave until everything was finished. No more excuses. The next afternoon, Kyle showed up reluctantly, but Alicia was nowhere to be seen. James didn't let that stop him. He focused on what he could control, working with Kyle. He delegated tasks and made sure that everything was getting done. Slowly, Kyle began to engage more. And when Alicia finally showed up, James wasn't afraid to tell her that her lack of participation was unacceptable. For the first time, Alicia actually listened. She apologized for her behavior and, together, they powered through the rest of the project. The day of the presentation arrived, and James stood at the front of the class, his heart pounding. He had led his group to the finish line, and despite the obstacles, they had pulled together a strong presentation. He could feel Mr. Harris's eyes on him, the challenge hanging in the air. When it was their turn, James spoke confidently, guiding the presentation with ease. His group had done the work, together. And as they presented, he could see that the other students were genuinely interested. Kyle, who had been quiet the whole time, spoke about the historical examples they'd chosen. Alicia, though initially hesitant, contributed her ideas with conviction. It was a far cry from where they had started, but they had made it. When they finished, the class was silent for a moment before Mr. Harris stood and nodded. "Well done, James," he said, his tone more approving than James had ever heard it. "Your leadership shone through in this project. It wasn't easy, but you made it happen." The once tense classroom environment had undergone a significant transformation, thanks to his leadership. He had proven not only to his peers but also to Mr. Harris, that he was capable of leading, even when the odds were stacked against him. But just as everything seemed to be falling into place, a final challenge loomed large, one that would test James' resolve more than anything he had faced so far. It was the last day of the semester, and Mr. Harris stood at the front of the class, his usual serious expression replaced with something that almost looked like anticipation. The students, now much more comfortable in their roles as collaborators and thinkers, glanced around at each other. They had grown accustomed to the tension that came with Mr. Harris's presence, but today, there was something different about him. "Class," Mr. Harris began, "I have one final challenge for you before the semester ends. This will determine the final grade for your leadership project, and it's not going to be easy." James' stomach sank. He had a sinking feeling that this would not be a typical end-of-term assignment. Mr. Harris paused, surveying the class, before continuing. "I'm going to pair you all up. You'll work together with someone you haven't worked with before. The catch? You're going to take on a leadership role in an unexpected situation, and you'll have to decide how to overcome a real-world problem, one that's been pre-selected for each pair." James' heart began to race. The task was sudden, unpredictable, and felt more like a test of character than anything else. No one knew what the problems would be or what it would entail, but they all knew one thing: it was about to get real. As Mr. Harris called out names, James felt a mix of nerves and curiosity. He had worked hard to make his mark as a leader, but now, with the stakes so high, he couldn't afford to fail. The first few pairings were read aloud, and he found that many of his classmates were paired with people they had either already worked with or knew well. But when Mr. Harris finally called his name, he was caught off guard. "James, you'll be working with Mr. Reynolds." James blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. "Mr. Reynolds? That couldn't be right." He quickly looked around the room to confirm, but sure enough, there was Mr. Reynolds, the quiet kid who always sat in the back and kept to himself. No one ever expected much from him. "Wait, you mean me and him?" James asked, his voice betraying his uncertainty. Mr. Harris nodded. "Yes, James. I want you to step out of your comfort zone. Leadership isn't just about working with those who are easy to get along with. It's about understanding your team, even when it's difficult. James swallowed hard. This was exactly the challenge he needed, though it felt daunting. He had never worked with Mr. Reynolds before and had little idea of what to expect. The kid was a mystery, a loner, someone who rarely spoke up and had a habit of blending into the background. But maybe that was why Mr. Harris paired them. It was a test of James' ability to lead in unfamiliar, uncomfortable situations. Mr. Harris handed out envelopes containing the real-world problems each pair would have to tackle. James opened his, reading the brief in disbelief. Their assignment was to come up with a plan to solve a community issue that involved both leadership and innovation. It was vague but incredibly broad. There were no guidelines, just a challenge to take charge and make a difference. "You'll present your solution at the end of the week," Mr. Harris announced. "Work hard. This will be your last chance to prove what you've learned." The weight of the task settled on James' shoulders. This wasn't just an academic exercise, this was an opportunity to make a real impact, to prove that leadership wasn't just about theory, it was about action. As the class dispersed, James turned to Mr. Reynolds, unsure of how to begin. Mr. Reynolds was sitting at his desk, already with his head down, scribbling something on a piece of paper. James hesitated, then took a deep breath and walked over. "Hey, Mr. Reynolds," James started, trying to keep his voice casual. "Looks like we're partners for this project. How about we talk about what we're dealing with here?" Mr. Reynolds didn't look up immediately, but after a few moments, he gave a small nod and raised his head. His eyes were dark, intense, but there was a quiet strength in them, something James had never noticed before. "I don't know what we're supposed to do," Mr. Reynolds muttered, his voice low. James took a seat next to him. "I get it. It's pretty vague. But I think we can figure it out together. We're going to make a solid plan. I've got a lot of ideas, but I'm going to need your input too. We can do this." For the first time since the announcement, Mr. Reynolds looked at James with something resembling trust. "Okay," he said quietly. "Let's do it." Over the next few days, James and Mr. Reynolds worked tirelessly. They spent hours after school researching, brainstorming, and trying to figure out how to solve the problem at hand. At first, it was difficult. Mr. Reynolds was quiet, and James had to dig deep to get him to share his ideas. But as time went on, James started to see the genius in his partner's thinking. Mr. Reynolds had a way of approaching problems that was unique. He thought in patterns, seeing solutions where others saw only obstacles. James started to rely on Mr. Reynolds more, trusting his quiet strength and sharp mind. They complemented each other perfectly. Where James was outgoing and confident, Mr. Reynolds was methodical and detail-oriented. Slowly, their different strengths began to merge into something powerful. By the time the presentation rolled around, they had developed a plan that was innovative, realistic, and could genuinely make a difference in their community. It wasn't flashy or extravagant, but it was practical, and most importantly, it was achievable. When the day of the presentation arrived, James stood in front of the class with Mr. Reynolds at his side. The nerves were there, but so was the quiet confidence that had been built over the past few days. As they presented their solution, James could see the approval in Mr. Harris's eyes. They had made it. They had taken on a challenge that seemed impossible and turned it into something meaningful. It wasn't just about getting the grade, it was about learning what leadership truly meant, stepping up, making connections, and finding strength in unexpected places. When they finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then, slowly, Mr. Harris stood and clapped. The rest of the class followed suit. James felt a wave of relief and pride wash over him. They had done it. As the class ended, James walked out into the hallway, feeling an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. He had come so far since that first day in Mr. Harris's class. What had started as a battle to prove himself had turned into a journey of self-discovery, leadership, and growth. Mr. Reynolds caught up with him, a rare smile tugging at his lips. "You did good, James. We really did it. James grinned, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. We did. I couldn't have done it without you. The lesson was clear: leadership wasn't about being the loudest or the most dominant, it was about understanding, adapting, and empowering those around you. It was about collaboration, humility, and the courage to face any challenge head-on. And as James walked out into the bright afternoon, he realized that this was only the beginning. His journey was far from over, but now, he was ready for whatever came next. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. What does leadership mean to you? Have you ever faced an unexpected challenge that forced you to step up? Share your thoughts below. Your story might inspire someone else to take action.